Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bill Brenner, Senior VP of Content here at Cyber Risk Alliance and SC Media. Welcome to this SC Media panel cast sponsored by Picus Security. And joining me from Picus is Crit Golden, Head of Solutions Architects, Simon Monahan, Product Marketing Lead, and for some in the trenches perspective, we are joined by Joy Purser, Field CISO at Veritas. So Picus Security recently analyzed over 600,000 malware samples to identify the 10 most common techniques leveraged by attackers based on the top 10 identified through the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So we're going to discuss the findings of the research, including the rise of evasive hunter-killer malware that systematically targets and impairs security controls to achieve its objectives. First, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. If you have a question, you'll want to select the Q&A button. So right below where you see our faces, there are 5 blue buttons, and the Q&A is second from the left. Meanwhile, second from the right is the handouts button, and you will want to select that because Picus has been kind enough to share some content, including the slides that we're about to discuss and the report that we're about to discuss. And so with that, why don't we dive in? Welcome, everybody.
Welcome. Glad to be here.
So we hear a lot about how the threat landscape is constantly changing, constantly evolving, but we also know it can be extremely challenging for security professionals to understand the extent of these changes and how they impact organizations. So let me start with you, Crit. There's a lot of threat intelligence out there. How do security leaders attempt to begin to determine what they need to prioritize?
Wow, that's a $1 million question. That's a good one, Bill. It's almost overwhelming, right? I mean, there's a lot of threat intelligence out there. There's so much out in the wild. It's really kind of difficult to understand it all. And really, the problem with threat intelligence is hard to make actionable. Right? Security leaders really need to understand the risk profile and focus on making those improvements in the areas that have the greatest security impact, right? And so to do that, really, you need actionable intelligence, not just threat intelligence, actionable intelligence. That's really important. Quantified risk really begins at the validation level, right? To truly understand your capabilities. What does my tech stack do? Identifying the gaps in your security controls and close those gaps and monitor for change. That's what I need threat intelligence to be able to provide me. What is the attacker doing today? What is that quantified risk to my environment? So I really would think today, if I'm looking at threat intelligence and how I ingest that and consume that from a security, how can I have an outcome from that threat intelligence? What is my action that I can take based on it? I don't just want to consume data, I want to leverage that data. So leveraging it, and the easiest way to leverage threat intelligence that I know of today is by validating your environment, challenging yourself, if you will, using that threat intelligence. But for me, it's critical that it has to be actionable. And if I can't ingest it and have a measurable outcome based on ingesting that threat intelligence, then I've maybe wasted cycles. So that's a really good question.
So Joy, as a security leader yourself, talk about how difficult it can be when it comes to operating in a landscape that's constantly shifting beneath your feet.
Security leaders really depend on their intelligence teams and solid information to be able to prioritize how they're going to resource. And there are a number of different good sources about threat intel, but I know from talking with other industry leaders that there is a real hunger for really understanding the specific attack vectors. Who is it? What is their motivation? And what are those specific techniques so that the people and the processes and the technology of the defenders can be aligned to meet those threats. And so I think if you're going to be studying attack techniques or threat intelligence, the MITRE ATT&CK framework really provides a great common vernacular for all of us to use to help identify what are those threat actor attack techniques.
Very good point.
So let's dive in to some insights that security professionals can use to better understand the threats based on Picus's recently published. This is the 4th annual Red Report, correct?
Correct.
All right. So, Simon, can you give us a brief summary of the Red Report for 2024, what it tells us about the extent to which adversary behaviors are changing, and how it maps back to what MITRE ATT&CK tells us that we need to be on top of?
Yes, Bill, absolutely. So as you pointed out, the Red Report, it's an annual study. And in compiling this year's report, what the team did is they analysed over 600,000 malware samples. And they analysed the behaviour of those samples and mapped the actions that they exhibited directly to the MITRE ATT&CK framework in terms of the techniques outlined across the framework. And this gave us the data really to identify which techniques are most prevalent. So which malware is using which techniques most commonly. Without kind of going at this moment into the top 10 most prevalent techniques, I think one of the key trends to highlight from the report first and foremost is what we're terming to be the rise of hunter-killer malware. Malware now, it's more sophisticated and invasive than ever, and that's demonstrated by the techniques that they're leveraging most commonly. This year we saw that around a quarter of malware samples that we analyzed having the ability to impair security controls. And what we essentially mean by impairing security controls is neutralizing them. To evade detection, controls are actually directly targeting endpoint and network security controls and trying to switch them off. So we've definitely a change in tactics here, where adversaries used to try and evade those controls. They're actually now directly targeting and trying to impair them directly because they see that as a way that they can achieve their objectives in a more efficient way.
So I think this is fascinating, and I want us to dive more deeply into one of the particular things that the report found is that one of the techniques had a 333% increase in its prevalence between 2022 and 2023. And I'd like you to unpack that, explain what that is and how that's being used in the real world.
Love to. I think, and I'll take that one actually. So it's first of all, get the report. It's fabulous data, very eye-opening. I've been doing breach attack simulation for 9 years, and since COVID, we've had an exponential increase in the volumetric amount of malware. What is startling to me this year is a 300% increase in hunter-killer malware targeting T1562, right? Impaired defense technique. That's a 25% increase. 25% of all the malware that we analyze can actually execute against that technique. Stop and think about that. This is a fundamental shift, not in low-level malware named attacks, TTPs, but really the art of war, if you think about it. Take out your adversary's defenses, everything becomes easy. The door is wide open. They're targeting network devices by turning them off, changing log paths. They're targeting EDR tools by disabling policies. AV engines aren't really much in play today, but they're actually targeting them as well. The idea is, instead of throwing all of your money into continually chasing the extended new capabilities of malware and code, let's turn off the defenses. Let's disable them. We're not prepared to really deal with that much in the defensive world today because we don't really challenge on an ongoing basis. So what does that mean? I'm blind. And if I'm not logging or alerting properly, I might not even know this is happening. How do you avoid this? You have to have an empiric view of your capabilities. I have to know what they're capable of. And more importantly, I have to know that they're returning the investment that I gave into them for the business. Am I mitigating from that particular perspective? So if your adversary is now not only targeting you with named attacks, ransomware campaigns, and all the other various ways of nefarious actions that they're taking against you, now they're targeting your tools. And I don't know that we really have thought about that and prepared to deal with that, other than validating what we do on an ongoing basis. I don't think periodically peering into our capabilities is returning the value that we expect. I think it takes a more dedicated approach to actually focus on that as a regular cadence. Think of it as part of your DNA, part of your program. Understanding change in your environment, I think it's critical, because with this type of rise in malware, it's targeting network, AV, EDR today. Who knows what it's targeting tomorrow, right? And the goal is to be ahead of that attacker as much as you can. It's a really good point, John.
Exactly. So I just want to expound on this sub-techniques of impaired defenses. So listen to this. These are all the things that savvy security teams are doing to detect anomalous behavior in the network. The threat actors are disabling or modifying tools. They're disabling Windows event logging. They're impairing command history logging. They're modifying system firewalls, indicator blocking. These are all of the basics that a good security program should have. And so I was talking with my colleagues in our security group internally at Veritas, and we were basically saying, what do you do if you now assume that a threat actor is in your system, is in your network? Because I think that's the new normal, guys, is that we assume that a threat actor is in the network and is employing stealth to persist. So what are some things that you can do to protect your most critical assets under that scenario?
Great question. And to your point, just real quick, sophisticated attackers, they don't hack you, they just log in. Right? They just log in, and that's the key. But go ahead, Simon. I apologize.
No, sorry. I was just going to say, Joy, I think you raised a really important point there about the need to develop that assume breach mindset, because attackers are so evasive now that really you have to assume that you've been breached and really seek to try and prove that has actually happened at a point in time. I think if we look at the techniques actually identified in the Red Report top 10, the techniques at 1 and 2 at the list are really concerned with living off the land. So attackers and malware is injecting into typical system processes to make itself evasive and hard to detect. And so that capability, combined with the more effective targeting of security controls now, makes the latest malware a new sort of breed that we as security professionals need to just kind of fully get to grips with.
So Simon, let's take us through more of a drill down of the visual that you currently have up here.
Yeah, well, I won't go into the techniques too much. I think within the report itself, there's some detailed descriptions of each of the techniques and kind of procedural examples of how attackers are replicating those techniques. But what I will focus on is more at a high level, what these key findings or what these techniques in the top 10 tell us. And I think one of the key points really is that the list shows us how attack behaviors are constantly evolving. This is the 4th annual Red Report, but if we compare the top 10 list against the list from the first report, it's actually very different. And that reveals, just the extent to which the threat landscape changes year on year. The Red Report is very much testament to that. And as you can see, there are 4 new techniques in this year's report, and we would expect that to change again next year. Some of the techniques that we've mentioned already make detection overall more challenging. About 70% of malware now is employing stealth-oriented techniques to simply evade detection by security controls. And then the final point really is around ransomware and how this continues to be so prevalent. And obviously it's a key risk for security leaders globally. Data encryption for impact, that has appeared on the report for the last few years. But what we've seen this year is 75% increase in the application layer protocol technique, which aids data exfiltration. And as we know, data exfiltration is now leveraged by ransomware actors as part of double extortion techniques. So we're seeing that combination of encryption and data exfiltration continuing to create risks for security teams.
So let me interrupt here. The application layer protocol. Tell us more about what that looks like, in a given scenario.
Do you want to take that one, Chris?
Yeah, there's many different ways to do it. The goal with application layer protocols in particular is to actually be able to execute them safely in your environment. To understand them and digest the information is one thing, but to actually be able to leverage them and challenge your environment to see how you respond in kind of a practice scenario, Joy, if you think about it, right? That the real goal is to understand what my capabilities are before the attacker actually, it takes advantage of us using that same nefarious activity. So regardless of what the attack level is, what the objective of the attack is, what MITRE technique we're traversing, how do I know how I perform against it? That's really the question that we're trying to answer. That's the output that we need. Understanding the data is one, but do I have defenses in place? Do I have mechanisms in place and mitigation capabilities in place to actually deal with those at an acceptable risk level? So in my mind, how do we go about doing that? How do I know if I'm protected? How do I know if some of these new techniques and the development of new sophisticated techniques and malware is actually I'm going to be successful in my environment? And I think that's part of the real output that we need to get to.
And that's a good Sorry, Joy. Actually, I was going to go right to you, so I just wanted to. So, Crit, you presented a good checklist, and so, Joy, my question to you is how, in your day-to-day, that applies to what your efforts have been.
Well, so application layer interfaces are a risk for any organization or company that's buying third-party applications. And I would say that third-party risk is a really focus area for a lot of the other security leaders in which I engage. And as you know, my company Veritas makes software products and we sell those. And so there's an increasing demand for software bill of materials or for other assurances that the software development build process is secure. Because as we see, there's a lot of risks throughout that process.
And what are some of the risks that cause you the most concern along the way?
So we think about the SolarWinds attack, right? SolarWinds company does business with everyone, and a threat actor got into the system, got into the network, into the code build pipeline, got actually into the repository of source code. And when someone at SolarWinds was building an update or a refresh, and they were putting the code back into the repository, the threat actor, who was employing stealth in the network, slipped in the bad software. And then SolarWinds went, unknowingly and spread that as a software update to everyone. And so that's a huge wake-up call for the risk now that comes with third parties. And so what we talk about at Veritas is the more that we can pre-integrate our software with other security tools or common applications that customers buy, then that reduces that attack surface. So the more pre-integrated products that you can buy, I would say that's better because then the software developer takes on the burden of security and doesn't push that onto the customer.
critters. Simon, any response? Anything you want to add to that before I go on to the next set of questions?
No, other than I think, again, this just highlights, right, the risk associated with doing business today, right? And all of the different vectors, to your point earlier, Joy, understanding those attack vectors. What are they and what techniques are used across those vectors? And do I have defenses in play? It's complicated, right? We often think security is as easy as just standing up tools and controls. It's much more difficult than that. So how do we actually start to answer all of these questions is really what I hear people ask me on a daily basis. How do I go about understanding my capabilities and what risks are posed to my organization?
So Simon, let me ask you now, before I do, just a reminder to the audience, we love interactions. So the more questions you ask, the better. And so if you have any, please, by all means, ask away. So having said that, Simon, let's talk through how security leaders can best leverage the findings of the Red Report to improve their effectiveness and their security programs in general.
Well, Joy mentioned at the beginning the importance of the MITRE ATT&CK framework in providing that that common reference point for security teams to better understand adversary behaviors. But whilst the MITRE ATT&CK framework is that very much an important resource, we find talking to customers that it can be very challenging to operationalize. I think there are over 240 techniques and even more sub-techniques within the framework. If you're thinking about trying to detect threats, which techniques in the framework should you look to prioritize ahead of others? It can get quite complex, quite challenging, and even quite time consuming to try and work out which techniques apply best to your organization. So this is really the beauty of the Red Report, and sort of defining that 10 most common attack techniques by malware. It's providing you some real insightful information to begin to try and prioritize where you dedicate your detection efforts to be able to create the most impact. And because if you can focus that a little bit more on common techniques, then you can, there's an argument to say that you can kind of mitigate your risk most effectively in those areas by doing so.
So before I move on to the next, Joy, anything stand out in terms of how you, so far, after looking at this, have started to think about how it applies for your team?
Yes. So another plug for this report. So the first thing is, sorry about the noise, process injection. That means that threat actors are injecting malware into normal processes of the organization so that the organization doesn't notice that there is something amiss with that process. So this is, again, that living off the land technique. And we see a 32% increase in that behavior. Another one, which is a new technique, which we talked about, impaired defenses, and I talked about all those subcategories. This is really serious, the impaired defenses. And I think companies need to really think about the sophistication of the threat actor and all the things that they are doing to impair defenses. And we need to have zero trust principles. We need to have multi-factor authentication everywhere, even at the file level. Number 4 technique is system information discovery. And we have seen instances where threat actors get into the network and then they lurk silently and look for specific applications that really can do the most damage. And then they learn or hire experts who know those applications and can disable them quickly. And so this system information discovery technique, number 4 on the Picus list, is also something that we're seeing as well. There's just so many. It's such a rich report, Bill, that I've used it a lot in my conversations, both internally and as well as externally at Veritas.
So, Crit, you knew I was going to eventually ask about where AI fits into all of this. And so this is as good a time as any. So the report makes a number of recommendations to help security teams prevent and detect all of what we've been talking about. But one of the report's key recommendations is around the need to leverage the latest and greatest in machine learning and AI technologies. Talk through how those technologies come into play with how your approach, so for the Picus approach and beyond.
No, thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. And just generally speaking, thank goodness for AI. A lot of people are scared of it, right? Adversaries, how's it going to affect our world, our culture? I see immense advantages for the defenders and on our side of the shop. You know, adversaries have been using AI for quite a while, and the defenses are now catching up. How can AI help? Generally imagine if you had a tool that not only lets you validate and challenge your controls, but then using AI, what's the answer to that test? Wow, if I'm not blocking, or if I don't have an alert, or I'm not doing log ingestion properly, what's the fix? That's very manual today. And what we do know by talking to customers all across the globe, and I know, Joy, you have the same problem, is resources are scarce, right? People don't have infinite resources. There's competing priorities. What is the most important? And the question a lot comes up to, how can AI benefit my organization? Really in augmenting humans, and in that fashion, leading towards the answers, understanding if I have a deficiency in my environment, meaning I'm not blocking a particular TTP. Maybe I can't stop the 25% increase in impaired defenses, as you just spoke about, Joy, which is amazing to me still. What do I do about that? How do I solve that? That's where we're seeing AI have a tremendous impact in helping solve the problem. Not about planning, not about understanding the environment, but solving the actual issues. What logs are needed? What detection queries may be needed for proper visibility, correlation, and alerting? AI is making tremendous strides, not only in our platform, but I see it across the entire security spectrum, on being able to actually help solve the problem with the tools we have, identify those gaps, and kind of help develop strategies to solve them specifically for vendors. And that's what I'm most excited about. Don't give me generic things to do. Tell me specifically, based on the tooling that's in my location, what do I do to solve it? AI is going to completely change the defender's world, I think, as much, if not more so, than it is for the adversary.
Would you agree with that, Joy?
Absolutely. AI is being used by the bad guys, but I think one important way that it can be used for cybersecurity defense is in behavioral analysis. The way to overcome the persistent threat actor is through behavior analysis, and AI can enable that. In other words, is there a normal behavior that has changed? And tailoring that anomaly detection is super important.
Deviation from a baseline, that's always an indicator, right?
So we have a question from the audience, and I'm going to read it verbatim. I'm tongue-tied today, so pardon me. Does the required use of digital signatures on API repository is the required use of digital signatures on API repositories objects an option?
Interesting question. I would say yes, and I certainly would say that it's needed. Probably need a little more context on that question. I think that's, it's open to a little bit of interpretation there, depending on where the question, the genesis of the question, if you will. But I think anytime that you can add confirmation capabilities to any process that you have in your environment, that's a good thing, right? And that's absolutely what you're doing in that particular case. So I don't know the specific need or the use case there, but I think that's certainly something you should look at holistically, right? Any additional confirmation, additional validation, additional efficacy in what my capabilities are, the security controls in my environment, or the mechanisms or policies I have in play, that's always a good thing.
I think what the Red
Simon.
Report tells us is that, oh, sorry, Bill, I was just going to add, what the Red Report tells us is that security teams can't rely on static IOC signatures to detect the techniques in the Red Report. You really need to be using behavioral analytics and leveraging more of this machine learning and AI really to identify the needle in the haystack, to identify that anomalous behavior from what's typical in your environment. So yeah, signatures, yeah, they're still important, but really you should be looking to develop detections in your environment that can look to reliably alert on some of these behaviors.
Bill, what AI is certainly helping Picus do as well is anticipate adversaries' moves. So machine learning can be a weapon against the adversary, and understanding potentially what the next moves or TTP development or actions they may take in a particular trend of an attack or a named group is helping us do some predictive analysis on what they're doing, and then proactively challenge environments on those as well. So really trying to stay ahead of the attacker is the goal, and AI is a tremendous asset and tool in our toolbox to help us do that very work.
Yeah, Crit's right, especially when it's combined with, the people and the process and the technology for anomaly detection. So for the tool is a tailored behavior analysis tool that separates the noise from a real true positive detection. But then the other thing is, organizationally, we see that the security teams are stovepiped from the infrastructure team or the backup team. And we see that as a security vulnerability, because what happens sometimes is that the infrastructure team will fail to communicate to the security ops center or the security team what is defined as normal behavior, so that you can really tailor the rule so that the SIEM or the security ops center can pick up the anomaly. So that's not necessarily a technology problem. That's a people and process problem.
That's correct.
So from the audience, first, for those in the audience who are asking if you're having trouble accessing the handouts, refresh your browser. That should straighten things out. And if not, just let us know and we'll get you everything that you need. But we have a couple of questions. Do we have to retrain our developers on how to spot abnormal code in the stuff they download? So who wants to take that one?
I'll take it.
Not much on the code development side, as I am the attacker and exploit side of the shop, but clearly, I think you need tools in place. I think training people, if you rely on people solely, and Joy, I'll probably defer to you to this a little bit, but if you rely on people alone, or that's the majority of your defensive layer, you're going to be sadly disappointed in the results. So clearly there needs to be automated capabilities, and certainly the proper tools in place can actually defend against those types of anomalous or nefarious activities. But as far as code development goes, I would certainly think that people are part of the process and part of the solution, but certainly there's an automated level of capability. And again, that's another area where AI can certainly step in. Machine learning can definitely step in and assist with that particular problem.
You absolutely need to train your developers for, security breaches or security awareness. And you need to go a step beyond that and do role-based training so that they see what threat actor behavior potentially looks like. And throughout the software product development process, you need to have tools in place like static code analysis, binary analysis, pen testers throughout the organization, all along that life cycle. You need to be patching for vulnerabilities. You need to be constantly maintaining that code, because as time passes, vulnerabilities emerge and it needs to be patched. We have feedback on bugs from customers. So there's just an entire really complex set of processes, teams, and tools that are involved in software development to ensure that it's secure. So
follow-up question. same person who asked the last question, just with some context. If I'm a developer, how do I know that an API has been messed with? So how do I know that a trusted download from any, let's say, GitHub has not been tampered with?
Joy, you want to take that one?
Not really, because GitHub has been impacted
Right.
too, right? So that's a tough question.
Yeah, I think we could certainly dive into that one much deeper. Clearly, the need to understand, if you're talking about API accesses, how do I protect that as well? There's so many channels into the business, right? So taking a little bit different angle, if we're talking API connectivity and anything's downloaded an API, who's accessing that API? When are they accessing it, and what are they doing? Do you have an API gateway in place? Do you have any protection schemas in place that help you mitigate those potential nefarious activities across that channel or vector? That's where you start, and then certainly, signed capabilities work very well for that. But I would really look at, one, who's accessing it, and what are they doing while they're accessing it. That will uncover a lot of information that you would need to help protect that particular vector. And I think that's really probably a good foundational place to start, is who's accessing it and when do they access it, and controlling that access, if you will.
Simon, anything you wanted to add to that before we move along?
No, I don't think so. I think Crit kind of covered it and summarized it very well there. So yeah, no more comments.
Very good. So, the report really doubles down on the recommendation that you need to perform security validation. And so, Simon, this question's for you. Talk about why that is important and how folks should be using the report to help in that regard.
Yeah, right. You're right. I mean, at Picus, we believe that security validation is absolutely fundamental to every security program. I think too often in security, we're forced to assume rather than obtain assurance that everything is working effectively. So validation is absolutely essential to prove that your security posture is as robust as you think it is, that your security controls are functioning as you need and expect them to, and that the processes in place, like your incident response plans, for instance, are effective as well. So without validation, without actually proving, then this could be, this could open up sort of a lot of risks for security teams. So we believe that consistent validation on a regular basis is really essential to kind of dispel assumptions and get that hard data that you need to understand your security posture and actually identify improvements. I think it's only within that data can you prioritize what actions that you need to take, what actions can have the most impact across your security program. Because as we've mentioned today, security teams are stretched. There are lots of priorities, lots of competing priorities, and it can be difficult to identify which areas to focus on. So by validating, getting that evidence, it's really crucial to every successful security program, in our opinion.
So, and Crit, Simon, whoever wants to jump in, how regularly do organizations need to validate?
Yeah, I'm asked that continuously, right? And depending on my resources and my ability to consume the data and ingestion capabilities, how often should I test? People often reference, traditional pen test, the annual pen test, which never gives you the evidence on how your tools respond. And quite frankly, that is woefully inadequate. I mean, it checks a box against compliance, I get it, but the attacker doesn't rest once a year, right? The attacker doesn't put out a few attacks every year. They're constantly churning. Look at the red report, right? 300% increase in some of these malwares for hunter-killer, 25% increase in impairing the detection tools and prevention tools alone, T1562. That's startling to me. So how do you do it? It's a continuous process is the answer. It's an iterative process. I'm trying to stay ahead of the breach. I'm trying to stay ahead of the attacker. I don't want to rely on a pen test or a red team or a tabletop engagement that doesn't tell me how my controls respond, lacking that empiric evidence to make those risk-based decisions on. So we often see, first and foremost, the understanding of your consumption capability. How many resources do you have? How do I crawl, walk, run? Apologies, I'm like you, Bill, I'm tongue twisted today. We often see weekly cadences being about the norm and returns the best benefit. It can be as little as monthly. Beyond that, you start to get behind the attacker. There's so many new attacks that have came out, new TTPs that have been developed. How do I know what my defenses are doing? More importantly, if I'm not validating on a regular cadence, how do I understand the effect of change in my environment? The problem we see not only on the attacker side is the constant churn and change around malware, but we see the same thing on our internal side. New people, new processes, new M&A acquisitions, you name it, introduces change into the environment. How do I know what that change is doing to my posture? So in short, weekly cadences, bi-weekly cadences, attackers release attacks every single day. Picus releases those attacks as well. It's not realistic to expect organizations to actually test every single day, but it is realistic to expect them to weave it into their DNA and make it part of their process, understanding that change and testing likely on a weekly or bi-weekly basis at a minimum.
Yeah, and also there's a lot of focus on left of boom in terms of we define an incident as boom, like something going off. But I think that we really need defense in depth. We need to have a layered security strategy so that we have endpoint detection, we're training our people, we have a lot of tools, firewalls, et cetera, for left of boom, but that we have good planning for business continuity, disaster recovery, specifically for ransomware, for incident response. And then let's not forget post-incident recovery. And I do think that companies, all organizations, should have tabletop exercises in which the leader of that exercise takes the network away and says to the teams, okay, go rebuild it from scratch. And then so you'd better be backing up your data so that you can get to it, but the threat actor cannot. So it needs to be immutable. And you need a sandbox or a clean room to rebuild that network. So you need an isolated recovery environment. And you need robust backups that are offline, where the clock cannot be disabled by the threat actor, so that in the event that you are breached, there is an incident that you can recover. I mean, this is the new normal.
You're very, just to add to that, Joy, you're so correct. It's a three-legged stool: people, process, and technology. If any one of those legs is not sound, I've got a problem in my environment. So challenging it on a regular basis, understanding empirically, not just that I have something written on paper, does it work? Is it actually something I can put into action? And that's critical to understand those capabilities. Not theoretically, practically and tactically understand those capabilities.
So let's focus in a little bit more on the role that automation has to play here. Specifically, the role in helping organizations ensure that the threat readiness against the various attack techniques that we're talking about, how to make it so that the responsiveness is faster, the solution is faster. So, Joy, I would start with you there. Thoughts on automation?
I think that tools employing automation can be employed at all levels of the security strategy, whether it's for the endpoint detection or anomaly detection. I think automating those tools, that technology, really can help introduce greater security, but should never be used as a crutch and need to be checked and validated by a person.
Kurt or Simon, any
Couldn't agree more. It takes a combination, right? I mean, I think societally, we're too apt to look at the silver bullet, the panacea. Oh, that can solve all of my problems. If I just do this one thing, I will now be in a better place. And I think what Joy highlighted there is you can't rely on any one stream, any one particular practice or component of your organization. Automation is critical, right? Resource allocation, stretching those resources, competing with competing priorities within the business, automating activities that lets the human highlight and manage those automated activities, but not remove the human, right? We're not to that point. So I think it takes a combination of both. Automation is critical to extending our capabilities and keeping up with the attacker, staying ahead of a breach, right? But we can't be reliant solely on any one individual stream.
So from the audience,
if I can, I would just say that
please do.
Automation is there to help augment manual assessments. So manual assessments like pen testing, Crit mentioned it, those assessments are still important, but we have to accept that because they're manual, they're more limited in scope, they're conducted at a single point in time. A pen test that you conducted last quarter isn't going to tell you if you're ready to defend against the attack techniques in the red report, ready to defend against the latest malware that your CEO has seen in the news and has asked you if your defenses are strong enough to prevent and detect it. So the benefit of automation really is to augment and enable security teams to validate on a more regular basis to ensure that they can keep pace, not just with changes in the threat landscape, but also changes within their own environments as well. Daily IT changes mean that misconfigurations, gaps can occur quite easily. So validation can help to identify those gaps and alert security teams to them much more swiftly.
Simon, on that topic, I'm often asked, can automated testing replace manual testing? And I say eventually, and in some cases it can today, but what I want to use those manual testing efforts for is a confirmation of what I'm already doing on an ongoing basis. An annual pen test shouldn't be the first time I understand or uncover a deficiency or a capability I thought I had that I don't have, right? Or being ineffective or low efficacy on security control tuning, for example. That should be a confirmation effort. This should be something that I have to look at on an ongoing basis. When you think about professional teams, they practice every day to go win the game. Our cyber team should do the same thing. So having a program in place leads to better outcomes on your pen test, on your red team engagements, on your tabletop exercises. Understanding empirically what my capabilities are, good or bad, is a good thing. I'm now standing on the foundation of evidence to make more effective decisions. That's the goal.
From the audience, the question is MITRE tracking double concurrent ransomware attacks?
MITRE can, because based on the techniques of those ransomware attacks, you can have mappings and understand what your capabilities are to MITRE. So whether MITRE is like individually tracking named ransomware groups, that I'm not aware of. I'm sure they are, but they certainly know the techniques that are in play. They certainly understand what is being leveraged. And then having a solution that lets you map your capabilities to MITRE is critical. Reading MITRE and understanding what the techniques are doesn't tell you what you're doing in your environment. So I think marrying the two together is really the outcome that we're looking for. Let me challenge with all of those ransomware campaigns, all of those techniques, my environment, my security stack, understand what my capabilities are, and then map that to MITRE so I clearly understand where my strengths are and understand where my gaps are. MITRE is incredibly important, as long as other frameworks, but MITRE is particularly incredibly important to understand defense in depth, to understand rip and replace scenarios and conversations. So I think that's a critical combination together.
And I think the value of this report is that it highlights what are the top techniques that threat actors are perpetrating. And just like Crit said, when you're trying to prioritize investments, prioritize strategy, focus areas, especially if you're a small or medium-sized organization, that's really difficult. And so being able to consider, hey, threat actors are using techniques so advanced that we may assume that they're already in the network. And so how do we protect information down at the data level? How do we identify our most critical assets? And if those are deleted or encrypted and we are demanded ransom, do we have specific procedures in place to know who's going to respond when? And what is that chain of command, that sequence of communications and activities that's going to occur in the event of a breach? And that we don't have to think about what we're going to do. We know. We just move right into action.
That's right.
That's the important thing to remember.
So we're reaching the wrap-up point. And so I want to wrap this up with a look ahead. And so, we've just talked about the top 10 for this year. Any predictions on what this list may end up looking like a year from today?
I can take this one if you like. I think
I've got some thoughts.
Probably
well, Simon, but I'll you take a swing at it.
I think it's pretty evident that next year's report will probably look quite different to this year's. I think we've already established that the top techniques change year on year. This year, we've seen a rise in the impaired defenses technique, adversaries being more targeted in their approach. And I think that's something that we'll probably see next year as well. I think on this year's list, we have system information discovery. I think we'll see potentially more examples of that technique being leveraged. Attackers looking to enumerate in the environment to better understand the environment, to be able to better achieve their objectives, understand how large the environment is, what assets are in there, how they can best achieve their objective by targeting the assets in the most evasive way possible. Ultimately, attackers are looking to execute their attacks quickly and effectively, and enumeration is a way for them to determine the best path to achieve their ultimate goals.
Crit, parting thoughts?
I do. For me, when really the conversation today is about an immense amount of topics, and really circles around change in the environment, really circles around trying to stay ahead of the adversary, understanding how their techniques and their priorities change over time. We'll see something completely different next year. Not completely different. We'll see different numbers for sure. This was a shock for us this year. We saw a little bit of a rise, didn't anticipate this much of a rise, and going after your particular software tools using hunter-killer malware. We talked about threat intelligence ingestion today. How do I make the most of threat intelligence? It seems daunting. And for me, I really just go back to fundamentals and basics. And I like to use analogies, but I say practice your craft. Understand empirically what your capabilities are. Don't just ingest data, put it into action. Understand with the data you have, what are my current capabilities? Do I truly have a proper defense in depth strategy? Can I potentially collapse part of my defense in depth and move it to another location because it's not needed? I can't uncover any of these pieces of empiric data on my posture if I don't practice, if I don't validate on a regular basis. The last thing I would say too is, for best results when you're looking at being proactive, and that's what we're talking about, staying ahead of a breach, trying to stay ahead of the attacker, is to be holistic, right? And meaning, don't leave something out or think, oh, I've got something covered, making assumptions because of a vendor or making assumptions because of a managed service provider. You should be challenging everything that you're responsible for. You should be challenging everything in your cybersecurity group to understand what the capabilities are. Do they seamlessly work together, or am I so siloed that we can't even pass simple information from a red team to a blue team, for example, or a blue team to a SOC team? So challenge yourself, practice your craft, challenge your technology, challenge your people, challenge your processes, just like you would think a sports team would, ready for game day, because breach day is coming. You're not impenetrable. Breach day is coming. So are you going to be ready for game day? When I look at it from that perspective, for me, it's about getting to the basics and challenging and practicing what we do every day.
Joy, you get the final word.
It really is about the basics. multi-factor authentication everywhere, robust business continuity plan to include a ransomware response plan. But I think if you're looking for predictions on threat actors, you need to think like a threat actor. So if I were a threat actor, I would be thinking about there's a lot of very important elections that are happening this year globally. And it would be important for me to try and influence those to an outcome that would benefit me and my objectives, right? And I would also look at industry verticals that have been especially hit hard with attacks in the recent term. And then I would look at the ways or the vulnerabilities of those industry verticals. So, for example, healthcare has been hit mercilessly in the past couple of years. They have a lot of very important data, and let's face it, people's lives are at stake. So, all critical infrastructure organizations, whether that be healthcare, banking, financial, energy, and telco, especially telecoms, because as nation states converge and seek to do harm, they will trade information on their specific trade craft. And we know that telecom operators, communications systems, and companies are at very high risk. So that would be my prediction, is an evolution towards where you can be successful in winning in terms of cybercrime, money, resources, or influence.
So we have to wrap it up, but this was great. This was great. Thanks to all three of you for being part of a lively discussion. Many thanks to our audience. Some good questions there. Great engagement. And thank you to Picus for sponsoring this panel cast and for providing this excellent content. So hopefully someday soon we'll do this again. But in the meantime, I wish everybody a fantastic rest of your Tuesday.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.